poorly or opaquely implemented, reducing the transparency and credibility of the electoral process. The key findings of this preliminary statement are as follows. Election Day. On Election Day, Carter Center observers reported that the voting process ran smoothly at most polling stations. However, in some areas, particularly Harare, Bulawayo, and Manicaland, polling stations opened late, in some cases for more than 11 hours. Although the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission extended voting hours and the government officially proclaimed August 24th as an additional election day, many stakeholders expressed concerns that logistical delays may have depressed voter turnout in those areas. Closing and counting procedures were assessed as largely positive in the limited number of polling stations that the Carter Center observed. Several hours after polls closed on the 23rd of August, Zimbabwean security forces raided the offices of the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network and the Electoral Resource Center, two accredited and well-known civil society election observation groups, arresting 39 people and confiscating equipment. The raid was an unnecessary and serious restriction of the fundamental civil and political rights of these organizations and individuals, and it prevented their efforts to contribute to transparency around critical phases of the election, including independent verification of officially announced results. The legal framework, the legal and the electoral framework. While the Constitution safeguards fundamental human rights and freedoms, including the freedoms of opinion and expression, assembly and association, subordinate legislation unduly limits those rights, including in the context of campaigning, and is not fully consistent with international standards. This includes advance notice requirement for public gatherings and demonstrations and limitations of freedom of expression under the so-called Patriotic Act. Election administration. The legal framework gives wide discretion to ZEC to regulate and supervise the election process, to register voters, delimit constituencies, design, print, and distribute ballot papers, approve the form of and procure ballot boxes, distribute, let me take that, approve the form of and procure ballot boxes, establish and operate polling centers and stations, and accredit both citizen and international observers, media, and party agents. The administration of elections lacked transparency in key areas, as the ZEC did not provide critical information in a timely manner during various stages of the process, which undermines public and stakeholder confidence in its management of the electoral processes. In addition, the restrictions and limitations on the work of election observers, including the late provision or denial of accreditation, severely hindered important independent transparency efforts. Voter education. While the ZEC conducted voter education and publicly invited civil society organizations, private voluntary organizations, and faith-based organizations to apply for ZEC accreditation as voter educators in May, some interlocutors reported that they were only granted approval in August, just days before the election. This prevented effective and timely voter education by a range of qualified organizations. Voter registration. The ZEC registered 451,811 new voters and transferred 191,738 registered voters to new locations prior to the elections. Although the voter roll was posted for inspection, public confidence in it remained low because of inaccuracies and errors. There were many reports during the inspection period of voters, finding themselves through the SMS system, but not on the physical voter roll. The ZEC attributed this to new ward boundaries and the delimitation. The ZEC attributed this to new ward boundaries and the additional polling stations following the boundary delimitation exercise. The ZEC did not provide electoral stakeholders with a copy of the final voter roll that could be easily reviewed or audited. Candidate registration. The Candidate Nomination Court sat on June 21 to process candidates for all levels of the election, including for the party lists. The ZEC issued directives on how the party lists should be structured just one day before the court, which constrained the ability of some parties to provide adequate numbers of women for provincial council party lists. Parties were allowed to resubmit lists, but this caused delays. Late decisions on these cases meant that ballots were printed late, which the ZEC cited as a reason for late delivery of ballot papers in some areas. Only the ruling party managed to submit party lists and candidates for every constituency and ward election and ran uncontested in around 10% of the wards. Political environment. While incidents of political violence were fewer than in 2018, tensions and polarization increased in the months preceding the elections as legislation restricting individuals' freedoms of speech, movement, and association, such as the Criminal Law Codification Amendment Act, also known as the Patriotic Act, and the PVO Amendment Bill were introduced. While the PVO legislation has yet to become law, but coupled with the Patriotic Act, its potential enactment has produced a stifling effect on Zimbabwean civil society. Campaign period, including social media. The campaign took place in a restrictive and highly polarized environment. Authorities were reported to have banned more than 300 public gatherings, making it extremely difficult for opposition parties and candidates to engage with potential supporters and the electorate. There were isolated instances of violent intra-party and inter-party clashes. Inter-party violence resulted in one reported death in Harare on August 3, 2023. The Patriotic Act, adopted in July, further stifled the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and negatively affected the exercise of the rights of freedom of association and expression, especially in the context of the campaign. Participation and inclusion. The legal framework contains commitments to ensure gender parity and provides for temporary measures to promote participation of women. However, these measures are not fully enabled in subordinate legislation, and no sanctions are in place for non-compliance. As a result, participation of women was less than in the previous elections, as political parties generally failed to ensure gender balance among their nominated candidates for directly elected seats, relying solely on seats reserved exclusively for women to give any inclusion for women. The large increase in candidate nomination fees limited all but the wealthy from running for National Assembly seats. Zimbabwe's political parties also generally failed to take steps to promote the participation of youth and people with disabilities as candidates. Role of civil society and election observers. Civil society plays a critical role in ensuring support for institutional electoral processes as well as the development of democratic space in a country. Notwithstanding pressure from authorities, Zimbabwe enjoys a vibrant civil society. The Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network, ZESN, and the Electoral Resource Center, among other civic organizations, have been involved for decades in strengthening civil participation as well as engaging on policies to improve the quality of electoral and democratic processes. These organizations deployed observers on the election day, and many regularly engage in civic education to promote inclusion and transparency of the electoral processes. The Carter Center noted, however, that there was a limited civil society participation in the August elections because of state restrictions and the ZEC's limited consultation of civic society in various electoral processes. The Zimbabwean government invited the Carter Center to launch an election observation mission for the August 23rd elections. However, authorities did not accredit 30 of the center's short-term observers. This action represented a severe and unwarranted obstruction of the Carter Center's mission, inconsistent with commonly recognized and respected norms and practices. This disrupted the center's methodology, forcing last-minute adjustments in order to enable observation activities while maintaining its core principles of independence, impartiality, and fact-based reporting. Conclusion. With the tabulation of results still underway at some tally centers, it is critical for Zimbabweans to wait for the announcement of the ZEC's final results in the coming days, and for key political leaders to abide by the provisions of the peace pledge. Given the highly polarized environment and lack of trust among political stakeholders, it is now especially critical for the ZEC to publish detailed reports at the polling station level, allowing political parties and observers to cross-verify the results in accordance with international best practice to help ensure transparency and credibility of the election process. The Carter Center wishes to thank all the stakeholders who have taken the time to meet with the mission. And we also express our sincere thanks and appreciation to all the media represented here today. A preliminary statement will be released shortly, and a final comprehensive report that includes recommendations will be released in the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. In a rush to jump into our findings for you, I neglected to introduce the other members of the panel. I have